Whenever most people think of the Normandy landings, they probably think of something like this. Soldiers rushing up onto the beaches amidst a hail of gunfire. They think of the sacrifice, they think of the brutality, and the death on that longest day. But here's the thing. Getting up onto the beach and facing the German army was only a very small part of what made the Normandy campaign so difficult and so extraordinary. And in some ways, it was the easiest part, or at least the most simple. Now sure, the Atlantic Wall was a major obstacle to surpass, and the Germans were hardly very welcoming of the Anglo-American armies landing on their stolen doorstep. But when we leave these sights of the individual soldiers and look to the wider picture, well, we see that there are far more existential challenges facing the Allies than MG-42s. In this video brought to you by the Native Oak, I want to talk about just a few of those problems. First, by discussing the Allied preparations and training for the invasion, then about D-Day itself, and ultimately the wider Normandy campaign. Now in this discussion, I've also pulled from a variety of different sources, and if you have an interest in reading any of them yourself, well, as always, you'll find the secondary sources linked below, while you can read the primary sources via the free digital library at nativeoak.org. With that, let us begin with our part the first, embarking on the Great Crusade, preparing for D-Day. Operation Neptune, what's popularly called D-Day, was the single largest and probably most sophisticated amphibious assault in all of military history. It demanded an unprecedented level of preparation and coordination at every level, from the highest general to the lowest private. In fact, the training for the invasion was so intensive and involved that it began at least a full year prior to it in July of 1943. For the American Army in particular, they were preparing for the fated liberation of France even before they left American soil. Neptune's after-action operational report described how GIs would be trained in techniques of unloading ships and craft and preparing and operating beach installations, as well as infiltration courses, both laying and removing anti-tank mines, working with pneumatic boats and pontoons, and deploying portable Bailey bridges to overcome obstacles in the field. Likewise, when the GIs arrived in Britain, they would undergo constant training, including physical conditioning, night problems, review of basic and combat training, and unit training. The soldiers would also attend a wide variety of specialist schools, including the more exciting and obvious stuff like demolitions, aircraft recognition, chemical warfare, heavy equipment operation, and being able to unload cargo freighters quickly under combat conditions, as well as things like water purification, and even drafting and sketching. In short, there's a whole lot more to cover than just knowing where to run when you hit the beach and how to keep sand out of your rifle. Of course, contrary to the typical American's view of the event, it wasn't just us doodles on Omaha Beach that day, but troops from all over the world were storming 5 different major sections of the Normandy coast. The Americans were tasked with taking beaches Omaha and Utah, the British with Gold and Sword, and the Canadians Juno Beach. And scattered in with these 3 major armies were also other troops from, well, across the British Empire, as well as from France. You had Dutch troops, Belgians, Danish, Czechoslovakian, Norwegians and Greeks, Polish soldiers, and others besides. And all of those men, wherever they're coming from, were all being trained in more or less the same manner, depending on what exactly their units that they were in were being tasked with on the day. And that training took place in towns like Slapton in Devon, which was fully evacuated by the British Army and taken over as a great big training ground, where large-scale dress rehearsals and live firing exercises would be carried out to both prepare the men to get accustomed to it all, and also to identify wider problems with the overall plan. Now, unfortunately, the use of live munitions in rehearsals, not live musicians, that would be far more entertaining, I'm sure, but live munitions in these rehearsals would occasionally lead to friendly fire incidents, the most notorious of them being during Exercise Tiger, when a simple communications error led to a few landing craft hitting the English shores right as a preliminary bombardment had begun. It was a terrible tragedy, and it was also covered up at the time, but if mistakes of that nature were ever going to be made, it was a lot better to experience them during the training so that steps could be taken to correct them for the day itself, when the scale, complexity, and the stakes would all be so much higher. The precise role of timing and coordination during the battle, and how extraordinarily important it was that everyone was on the same page, will become readily apparent in our next section. But while we're on the topic of timing specifically, I think it's a good opportunity to mention this video's sponsor, which really is unlike any that I've had before. And if you're interested in the story of the Battle of Normandy, it's something that you'll want to hear about, I think. Praesidius Watches creates timepieces that are not only inspired by military history, but are explicitly rooted in it, often going so far as to use soil or other artifacts from actual battlefields in their construction. And 1 year ago today, on the 80th anniversary of Operation Neptune, they took a case of their newest watch models that are inspired by D-Day, and quite literally buried them under Utah Beach, where for the last year, they have been aging in the exact same saltwater and sand, well, maybe not the exact same, but the same, you get the idea. It's the same beach, right? The same sand that the American soldiers were fighting and dying over all those years ago. Now, the point of that isn't so that, they can showcase some, machismo, we've got military-grade materials, whoa, look how clean they are even after all the time. That's nonsense, right? That doesn't actually mean anything, and a lot of companies will sort of, prattle on about that kind of nonsense. But, I mean, with this, though, they're quite literally advertising that, no, these watches will not be perfect. They will be scratched. They will be worn. And that's exactly the point. They're meant to be, flawed in that way, right? They're intended to reflect the severity and the solemnity of the event that they were placed in commemoration of, which was hardly a, walk in the park because of military-grade technology or anything like that, right? These are watches that are literally shaped by the history and the place itself. And today, June 6th, 2025, on the 81st anniversary of the battle, they're going to be going back out and digging up those watches. So if you're interested in learning more and maybe picking up a Praesidius watch for yourself, well, then you'll find them via the link down below. I mean, really, if nothing else, I think it's a really cool project. And if it inspires you in any way to just think a little bit about the passage of time, both since the event and on the fateful day itself, and what all those Allied soldiers went through, well, then I think you should check it out. And of course, when you engage with my sponsors, you're supporting me as well. So really, it's a win-win for everyone involved in the process. So thank you very much to Praesidius Watch Company for sponsoring this video. I think they really were not only a perfect fit for this topic, but unlike most sponsors, they actually very clearly cared about the history and the topic that I selected for this video. They agreed that it was an important one, even if perhaps it wasn't the most exciting one, Saving Private Ryan type stuff, right? So I'm very happy to work with them on this, and I'd love to do so again. So with that, we'll return to our topic. Now, as I was reading through the operation report, which covered not only the battle itself, but many of those preparatory mock battles and exercises, something that really struck me was just how mundane so many of these issues that the Allies faced really were. These weren't problems like, well, we're expecting overwhelming firepower in this sector of the line. We're going to need more bazookas and tanks and whatnot. Instead, no, they were problems relating to, again, scheduling and coordination, the sorts of things that rely on soldiers, checking their watches all the more frequently, right? For example, during Exercise Fox, the report specified, ironically, that too many reports were being requested, presumably by officers who were desperate to know what was going on from men who were too busy dealing with what was going on to report on it. There were also poor communications, the report said, between the beachmaster and the coasters on that day, which led to a delay in landing supplies. And a really important issue was an insufficient degree of coordination between divisional headquarters and the military police. Now, hold on, you may be saying. MPs? You mean those guys whose job it is to make sure you've got your pass before you leave base? What could they possibly have to do that's so important on D-Day? Well, actually, their role was incredibly important. Perhaps not right at the first wave hitting the sand, but certainly immediately thereafter, in all of those very mundane yet vital tasks to keeping up the war effort, as was well demonstrated for any who may have doubted it during the largest training exercise of the entire war, Exercise Fabius, when military police were not phased in early enough to control traffic from the start. In several instances, there were no military police for important posts. Military police companies had sufficient signs, but these were not available early enough. Military police were not briefed in the marshalling areas. Brigade vehicles were allowed to bunch on the beach while awaiting assignment. Drivers were found asleep in brigade vehicles parked on the beach lateral road. These had been sent to the beach, but no one was there to give them orders. Improper signage and traffic jams. It's nowhere near so sexy as big guns and barbed wire and bunker networks of the Atlantic Wall and whatnot, but you know what? If you have all of these ships landing who knows where on the beaches and unloading tens of thousands of men and vehicles that they're all trying to coordinate and get their way to a myriad of different objectives, well, all of a sudden, having sufficient knowledge of where everyone and everything is, that becomes incredibly important. It all is about timing and coordination, logistics. Knowing where to establish the ammunition depot or the field hospital and having the proper signage to be able to find them and access it all. I mean, being able to get to them because the roads are made clear. These are the sorts of silly little things that can literally make or break an entire campaign, especially one that was as risky as the invasion of Normandy. Again, training, coordination, timing, keep an eye on your watch, Praecitus watches, sponsored, go check them out. And of course, you know what they say through all of this about the best laid plans. Regardless of how much preparation you have, there will be problems on the day itself. I mean, that's a major reason for all of the training to start with. It's not to avoid the problems entirely, but rather to better understand how to deal with those problems when they inevitably arise. You wouldn't have to train all these guys for a year plus if everyone was expecting the exact precise plan to just be followed, clean slate, nice and easy. You always have to prepare for contingencies on contingencies on contingencies, right? And once again, some of the biggest issues that the Allied armies would face on the day itself would ultimately have very little to do with the actual Germans. And so we come to our part the second, hit the beach, the complexity of Operation Neptune. One of the pre-mission briefings for the American 29th Infantry Division was a fascinating mixture of courage-inspiring statements that stressed the great importance of the mission being undertaken, alongside more practical reminders on more technical elements, like the importance of tying and wearing one's life preserver appropriately to prevent drowning. The briefing ended with a simple sentiment echoed throughout all of the Allied forces: when we hit the beach, clear it, and keep moving fast. The Normandy invasion was massive, and it's difficult to really convey its magnitude through numbers alone. Nearly 7,000 ships, including 4,000 landing vessels and 900 merchant vessels, alongside some 1,200 warships that would be used in an invasion that took place over roughly 50 miles, or 80 kilometers, worth of French coastline. Now, this is a dramatically imperfect measure, but that's around 140 ships for every mile of beachhead, or just under 90 for every kilometer. Likewise, over 11,000 aircraft would fly nearly 15,000 sorties on D-Day itself. And divided up evenly, that's at least 10 missions for every minute of the longest day. And all of this, of course, was in support of over 150,000 ground troops, which looks a little something like this. Now, the opening sequence to Saving Private Ryan, iconic though it may be, and actually really good in a lot of different ways, it does have a few pretty big issues that really affect the way it portrays the battle versus how it was actually fought. Now that's a topic for another day, and actually Indy Neidell has a wonderful video going over that scene in detail for its authenticity, which I'll be sure to link down below if you're curious to learn more on what it does right and what it does incorrectly. But one thing that I do appreciate about the portrayal is that they show a wide variety of different soldiers hitting the beach and the confusion inherent with the complexity of their mission. Like how at one point Tom Hanks runs into a medical battalion who were intended to establish a field hospital. We even get this wonderful little scene where a guy drops a typewriter in the middle of battle. He's carrying a typewriter, and it makes a delightful little ka-ching noise as he does so. Now, to be fair, the typewriter makes a lot more sense when you consider the distances that the actual battles were being fought at. That's beside the point. Then later on, though, he runs into Navy beach battalion men that are working on blowing up a Czech hedgehog in order to clear a path for advancing armor. There was a massive variety of different unit types all hitting the beaches that morning, ranging from combat engineers and armored units, to naval fire control parties, artillery and anti-aircraft units, battalion and divisional headquarters units, even chemical weapons battalions. Likewise, within the infantry itself, not everyone was just a standard rifleman or a machine gunner, but mixed within them were teams carrying bazookas, flamethrowers, of course Bangalore torpedoes. There were also wire-cutting teams, demolitions men carrying TNT, mortar crews, medical personnel, and many more. And each of these different units and teams would be deployed in a very specific way to land in certain sectors at certain times to complete a wide variety of designated tasks. Of course, the rough conditions of the invasion itself and the inherent difficulties of coordinating this kind of activity, even without enemy fire getting in the way, often had these craft landing far off their intended course, even up to a mile away. For example, according to the report Omaha Beachhead, published after the war by the American War Department, the Army-Navy Special Engineer Task Force had one of the most important and difficult missions of the landing. Their chances of clearing gaps through the obstacles in the half-hour allotted were lessened by accidents on the approach to the beach. Delays in loading from LCTs to LCMs and in finding their way to the beaches resulted in half of the 16 assault teams reaching shore 10 minutes or more, egad, late. Only 5 teams hit their appointed sector, most of them being carried eastward, with the result that Dog Beach received much less than the effort scheduled. As a further effect of mishandling, at least 3 teams came in where no infantry or tanks were present to give protective fire. Men burdened with equipment and explosives were excellent targets for enemy fire as they unloaded in water, often several feet deep. This account, of course, is only one amidst a veritable sea of incidents of missing equipment, missing vehicles, and entire teams either not making it to their objectives or not hitting the beach at all. Even when things went exceptionally well, the conditions on the beaches themselves would naturally lead to delays and choke points and overall reduced combat effectiveness. For example, the same book references how, quote, all weapons were likely to be temporarily put out of action by the effects of water and sand. The first thing some units did on reaching cover was to strip and clean their rifles. And all of this combined led to a situation where, again pulling from the same text, about an hour after the first landing, senior officers would find that along 6,000 yards of beach, behind sea walls or shingle embankment, elements of the assault force were immobilized in what might well appear to be hopeless confusion. As a result of missed landings, many companies were so scattered that they could not be organized as tactical units. In some places, notably in front of the German strongpoints guarding draws, losses in officers and non-commissioned officers were so high that remnants of units were practically leaderless. Bunching of landings had intermingled sections of several companies. Engineers, Navy personnel from wrecked craft, naval shore fire control parties, and elements of other support units were mixed in with the infantry. In some areas, later arrivals found it impossible to find room behind the shingle and had to lie on the open sands behind. Through all of this, think about how little we've mentioned the enemy's defenses, right, and all of the work that they did. Now, all of these difficulties were, of course, accentuated by the fact that this was an opposed landing, absolutely. But ultimately, I think this is the really big thing that's so important to understand, is that even if the Germans had just sat by and watched it all happen, there would have still been enormous challenges for the Allies to overcome in landing, establishing the beachhead, and then pushing forward. In fact, even after the Germans had gone entirely and the beachhead was totally secured, the Allies still dealt with massive problems there, upon which their entire campaign and the liberation of France would all rely. And so we come to our final part, the third, frantic supply, Allied logistical issues after the beach. If you've ever played a game of Hearts of Iron, you know how important it is, once you launch an amphibious assault, to quickly take control of a port that might be used to land supplies for your troops. Same thing in real life, as unloading hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies on an empty beach is hardly very efficient, if it's even possible to begin with. So until the Allies could seize a major deep-water port, which incidentally took far longer than they would have hoped, owing to a stiff German resistance, hey, we can finally have a problem we can blame the Germans for there. Well, in the meanwhile, they had to establish temporary facilities known as mulberry harbors. These were artificial harbors built on the Normandy coast out of large concrete caissons called Phoenix breakwaters that were constructed in the UK and hauled over with tugboats right alongside the invasion forces. In total, over 200 of these massive blocks were built, intended to be brought together, forming two mulberry harbors, one on Gold Beach and one on Omaha, although the latter was severely damaged in a storm during construction and was never completed. The one that did see service, however, allowed larger ships to be unloaded directly to the shore without first needing to transfer cargo to shallower vessels, and literally millions of tons of men and supplies were landed on it. But even then, it wasn't enough to completely fuel the invasion force, and a great deal of those landings were still taking place directly on the beach itself. Even if both of the mulberries were active, of course, they were still small temporary facilities, and supplies were slow to arrive, to say nothing of the sheer volume and variety that was required to be moved. And what's more is that as they were being offloaded, for most of the campaign, it was all taking place along an extremely narrow front, which resulted in supply choke points and delays. So it wasn't that the food and ammunition wasn't there at all, so much as it was that there were only so many physical roads and railways and facilities to facilitate and move those supplies even after they'd been offloaded. You know, the countryside of northern France was hardly equipped to deal with this kind of logistical challenge. Even if all that infrastructure wasn't bombed by the Allies in anticipation of the invasion, and then later sabotaged by the Germans on the way out, then trying to coordinate so many tens of thousands of soldiers and move so many millions of tons of supplies all along such a narrow position, I mean, it's like a giant sliding puzzle, and the only way to relieve it is to firstly capture some major port cities, and secondly, to improve your transportation network by repairing all those roads and rails, and capturing or bringing in rolling stock and trucks and other vehicles. And that all takes time. It takes physical space, and it's all being done during a war. Now, ultimately, all of these problems were compounded by the speed at which the campaign was progressing. At first, by how slowly that speed was going, and then ironically, by how quickly it went. To put a very long story short, the initial days of Operation Overlord, while they succeeded in establishing a beachhead, didn't exactly progress according to plan. The campaign met with a number of failures that slowed it down significantly, with the entire army basically funneling into a very narrow front. But then, as time went on, things sped up. Very, very rapidly, and by August, the Allies were fully driving the Germans out of France. And the result of that was a severe bottleneck, the likes of which was described perfectly in the book The Lorraine Campaign by Hugh Cole. which tells how the rapid advance at the end of Operation Overlord could not but disrupt a system of supply based on the expectation of a more gradual and evenly paced advance across France. During late June and the month of July, determined German resistance had held the Allies to an exceedingly constricted area, making it impossible to carry out the scheduled and methodical forward movement of supplies, supply installations, and transportation facilities on the continent. In August, the Great Allied advance had quickly regained the operational schedule which had been lost in Normandy, and then had as quickly outrun it. Motorized and mechanized columns fighting a war of movement could function on a flexible tactical timetable, but the time element in the movement of low-priority service troops, of cargo unloading, the creation of forward supply dumps and depots, the construction of pipelines, the rebuilding of railways, and the acquisition of adequate rolling stock could not be treated so cavalierly. In short, the tactical situation which had resulted from the stalemate in Normandy and the unexpected speed of the advance over the Seine and across France had created an extraordinary logistical lag. And this resulted in a scenario by late August that, despite the Allies winning victory after victory, the author described as one of frantic supply, wherein the armies were being maintained on a day-to-day basis. Still, the bulk of all Allied materiel was coming over the Normandy beaches and carried by trucks rather than more efficient railways directly from coastal supply dumps to combat zones. The roads and rails had all been bombed, and the beaches were totally congested, while still there were vehicle shortages. Meanwhile, the book continues, pipelines and pumping stations to carry gasoline forward took long in building, and gasoline was being drained out so fast for immediate use that the sections of pipeline which were finished could not be kept full. So ultimately, even after the beachhead was captured, and even after the ports had all been seized, still, whether they couldn't push the Germans back at all, or whether they were exhausting themselves from running after a fleeing enemy, the Allied armies still had these massive logistical issues to overcome. Now, ironically, in some ways, they wound up suffering more from their rapid advance than they did from their stagnated delays. And that is why, as we come to our conclusion, I named this video The Allies' Biggest Problem on D-Day. I suppose I could have made it problems, plural, but these myriad logistical concerns, right, they may not have been the most iconic of the day, or the most frightening, or even the most deadly, at least in an immediate sense. But they were certainly among the most existential problems that these armies faced, not only in terms of literal scale, but also in their deeper significance and the amount of suffering that they could have, or outright did, produce. Because at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter if you have the best equipment if you can't get it to the men. It doesn't matter if your best soldiers are going to brave the beach and clear the bunkers and liberate the towns if they can't be properly fed afterwards. Regardless of the skill of the fighting men, it is the logistics behind them that makes the whole thing possible. And of course, it is also the problem that, again, like quite literally, is just, physically speaking, the largest of them all, the most complicated of them all. It goes far beyond just infantry doctrine or anything like that. It is the core upon which the entire military effort relies. As the old adage goes, amateurs talk tactics, but professionals study logistics. Now, thank you all for watching. Remember, of course, to visit nativeoak.org to find all the primary sources that I've used for this video, listed as free digital downloads. And, of course, remember that this video was made possible by its sponsor, Praesidius Watches, and their commitment to sharing the story of Operation Neptune. If you'd like to learn more about them, please do so via the link in the description. Remember, when you support the sponsors that support me, you also support me in a pretty big way. You know who also supports me in a big way is my supporters on Patreon, including our newest members, Joseph, maybe Yosef, you can see it spelled there, and John, by whose generosity all of my work is made possible. Now, unfortunately, there are no viewer-submitted pieces of artwork for me to show you today, but if you'd like to submit a piece of your own for me to show the audience, just shoot me an email over at brandonf@nativeoak.org. And until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain, of course, your most humble and obedient of servants.